Start with a question first, and I'll put this one out there in terms of DevOps, and I'll put this to our operators. We have CenturyLink as Adam, and maybe you can ask a question, or I answer a question first of DevOps. What do you do, and what do you see in the community, and what are the challenges inside your company right now that you've already addressed because you've been doing it for many years? And then we'll move over to Telefónica, and we'll ask some questions around that.
It's an immensely complicated problem. So first, I've been at CenturyLink for 9 months. I have 9 months experience as a carrier. So 20 years in the industry, but 9 months as a carrier. So it's been a very different experience than I thought it would be coming from the vendor world into the other side of the fence here. So I don't look after operations. There's a guy named Todd Miller at our company. He's a great guy who looks after operations. And what I look after is the development side of what's supposed to be DevOps. I manage SDN and NV engineering, which is really a development organization. And so the challenge, is this is radically different for what we do today. Our tooling or our organizational structures are all built around, there's obviously the silo component, but in addition to that, we built our businesses to be optimized around dealing with vendors. And so we're optimized around dealing with vendor customer service. We're not optimized around dealing with, development organizations on the other side of it. And the transparency that's necessary for DevOps, wasn't a key element of that relationship. We would send logs over, they'd send us fixes, we'd go backwards and forwards, but a person at one end of the scale never spoke to the subject matter expert at the other end of the organization. If you think about DevOps as a kind of continuum, customers at one end and engineers, and the engineers that live in the darkest rooms at the other, there's supposed to be transparency between those two places. We were never optimized around that. And so culturally, this is a very significant change. And the further you drill into this, what you start to realize is that if you started from scratch, you'd have a very different staffing model as well. So as you start down this path of looking at DevOps, what you start to learn is that if you take on this task of transparency and you start to look at all the pieces and all the people in that continuum from ops all the way through to dev, you have a whole bunch of gaps in your organization as well. So it is an immensely complicated problem.
So thank you. I'm gonna pitch that over to Javier then in terms of, transparency is a scary topic from our customer giving to their supplier because you're going to see all the ugliness, the challenges that come along with it. Javier, what's your opinion?
Well, that's part of the fun.
It's part of the fun. That's part of the fun. Good.
Yeah, but first of all, I'll give some context of what is my role with Telefónica. There are many activities related to virtualization and software, and obviously not all any of application of a DevOps methodology. In our case, I'm responsible for the NFV Reference Lab, which is an organization where we evaluate the technologies and the evolution of technologies for virtualization, for the virtualization plans of Telefónica. So it's an organization mainly for development and testing. Okay. And that is where DevOps comes, because we use intensively and DevOps tools and methodologies for that purpose, which means that you have a degree of visibility pretty good whenever that the supply chain is ready, because not in all the cases the supply chain is ready for that, or even the technologies that you need to evaluate fit properly in the kind of tools that you might have in a tool chain. We can elaborate about that later if you want on case by case. But that said, I mean, it's pretty powerful because it's a way of seeing that the continuous changes in versioning. When you add a new patch to solve something, you are not breaking anything, and that is in such a complex environment like this, where you don't have pieces of software running in isolation anymore. You need to see continuously the interaction between them, no matter what is the role in that architecture. Having a methodology that automates that process for you is essential. I can't imagine our way of work without having some degree of automation, honestly. That said, that has challenges because it's not the same running a piece of software in isolation in a lab than running it in production and applying those changes and updates. It's extremely risky if you apply it blindly, so you need to put some boundary conditions there that we are still, I think, figuring out on how to do that smoothly. And it's more challenging than in a regular cloud environment because, as I said, there are strong interactions between the elements. There are elements that are in the middle of a flow, and you can't simply upgrade them and see what happens. It's more complicated than that. You need to take into account many actions. So that is something that we need to try to figure out. And in a lab, it's pretty simple, because you can simply switch off everything and restart it. But in production, it's not that trivial. And while you have a microservice architecture for anything, let's imagine, for traffic flows, it doesn't fit that well. So you need to do something cleverer, which is that clever that we are still figuring out, right? so we need to learn by doing, and perhaps it's not the right methodology. So we need to see it. And there's one third component is since we are a organization of development mainly, we are trying to accommodate our DevOps methodology with the DevOps in other communities. In our case, that it's obvious that we are contributing substantially to OSM. OSM has its own CI/CD pipeline, and we need to make sure that whichever that we run is coherent with what is going to happen there. So we have reasonable expectations that things are going in the right way. So that is, we need to be suppliers in that case, and that is a good exercise, because it puts you on the other side, and I need to learn that you need to push the software in a given manner to make sure that it won't break anything else in the other side of the chain.
So I'm going to push on that third one a little bit, and there's a reason I put Marc right next to you, other than the two of you need to leave a little bit early, but you talked about open source and contributing to OSM and how that is. And Marc's coming from us from the Linux Foundation and responsible for a lot of the activities in the networking side. So what are your thoughts when you hear about DevOps from the operators and how they can use that or use open source community to help them with their operations and how they're introducing new services?
Well, I think, first of all, DevOps is going to be a disruptive force to operators who are used to delivering software on a time scales that are very, very different. I mean, we're thinking more along, I mean, traditionally it's been maybe 1 to 2 years or 2+ years from the time that a release actually comes out to the time it's deployed. I think one of the steps in a positive direction is SDN and NFV have not only changed the technologies that are involved and put us on a path toward automation, which is one of the key factors for DevOps, but also what it's done is it's opened the door to more open source contributions that are on a very different time scale. I mean, if we think about the typical releases, I mean, OSM's coming out at a cadence of approximately 6 months. The OpenO project at the Linux Foundation for Orchestration, similar 6-month cadence. We're already on a DevOps path. You know, we're getting from a couple years to 6 months for a release. That's an encouraging sign. Obviously, it's not there, but it's a step in the right direction. And more importantly, it changes the expectations, because the impact on operations and ultimately the siloed organizations that need to come together to make this happen is not something that's going to be trivial in most of the operators that we've been engaging with over time. Now, the other factor that the Linux Foundation is trying to address is that I think Francisco-Javier brought up is the tooling, the continuous integration, continuous deployment tool chains that are really critical toward putting in place this more continuous mindset in getting new software and really not so much software, but getting new functionality out the door. And one of the steps that we've taken at the Linux Foundation is to put in place the Open Platform for NFV, or OPNFV, which has been a very unique open source project in that it's addressing the methodology. It's not so much addressing new functionality, it's assuming that the open source components and platforms that have been developed by other communities are going to have to come together at some point, since this is networking. And what we've attempted to do is focus on that methodology and the tooling that's required in order to support CI/CD moving forward, another critical area for DevOps. So overall, what we're seeing is encouraging signs. We're seeing the SDN and NFV disruptive mindset help with the internal discussions that are required in most operators to actually get onto this path, and then bringing in technology pieces as we can, leveraging the cloud in general.
Thank you, thank you. So now I'm going to turn a little bit to Anshu and HPE and you know, you as a vendor and a contributor in here. we talked on the phone and you said failing fast and failing often, which is in the DevOps kind of a world, is challenging inside the operator community because they don't like to fail. And me as my cell phone, I hate it when anything fails on my cell phone. But bringing it from the lab into the network and some of the experiences that you've had, what do you think when an operator picks up the phone and says, I want to move to a DevOps community, DevOps model, and HPE, I want you to help me with that? How does HPE look at that and go, one, yeah, here's my contract, I'm going to charge a fair fee, all right, because we're all here as a community to make sure we're healthy and making some money. But what are your thoughts on the challenges there?
So, well, thank you for having me on the panel. I think there's one saying from a lean development, software development, which is even more applicable today in DevOps, is think big, act small, fail fast, and recover rapidly. It's even more relevant today in the DevOps world. And when say, a service provider picks up the phone for a vendor like HPE, it's not a new thing for a vendor like HPE because anybody who's done cloud business has done DevOps, okay? But in the service provider world, it is a new phenomenon. And what it requires, there are a couple of changes that it requires on both vendor and the service provider side. Transparency, okay? Adam talked about transparency. Is that a scary
word or is that a good word? And I'll throw that out to all of you. But
for vendor, it's an excellent word.
Excellent.
Okay, excellent word because I've been product manager in my career, and for a product manager to know what the requirements exactly are, it's the holy grail. Okay, there is no product feature holes that you will feel in your requirements if you are so tightly ingrained with the customer. Okay, so transparency is a great thing. It does lead to issues like feature creep and stuff like that, but the feature agility you can get, anything that it's unbelievable. But it is different organizations that have to interact with it, so it does require training, skill sets. Many things are good, and contract is different too. It's not a software license that you kind of give it to the service provider and say, you know, this is my fee and this is my service fee. There is an agreement which is definitely more complex, and we've done for several service providers, and one of them is very public, and I think we've shown it in Mobile World Congress, Swisscom. There's a complete DevOps operation that we have done. It does require us to be very much in sync. Our cycles, development, QA, operations, integration, all those cycles have to be very aligned. It's Scrum methodology, so it's one team. You cannot think of it as a vendor, supplier, and a customer team. It is certainly challenging initially, but for our cloud, it's kind of, it's been done for a long time. For service provider, it's certainly a new phenomenon, but it's taking shape, I think.
Okay, thank you. Javier, so as you hear that and you internalize what's being said, what are some of, as you've worked with various vendors as well as pulling in open source, has it all been smooth? We talked and you were a little bit skeptical. You were like, is it working or?
Somehow, no.
Somehow it's working.
I mean, not everyone is comfortable with transparency.
Yeah.
and I can understand that because there are intermediate stages in the software that probably are not ready for any testing, and you want to make sure that whoever who is using that software has the right context to use it and assess what is being delivered. And since it's not internalized or you don't have that mutual trust in each of the end, sometimes they feel more comfortable on having clear releases. And that's a fact. And I love that everyone were ready in the supply chain for doing that, but not everyone is following that, and there are good reasons. Actually, there are other good reasons, so I'll put also the part of the charges in our side, in the side of the service provider. You mentioned the Holy Grail is having clear requirements. The problem is that sometimes we don't have that discipline, and because the theory says that you push on software, you're running some automated testing, and you know where it is. The problem is that automated testing conclusive? And is it sufficient? It's not anything else that said, and by the way, I also need this. So that is also requires some changes as well to get ready from our side, because that requires not only a change of mentality, but also some specialized work on creating that automated testing and making sure that you have a sufficient battery of tests from the day zero that are sufficient to drive that work efficiently. So you do not bring more confusion and clarity. And that is something that needs to change as well. And the problem with this is that you cannot start from scratch and start gradually. You need to have a minimum set of tests already in place in order to be efficient in that tool chain. Otherwise, the vendor will say, look, I'd rather go to the traditional way and you stay in your comfort zone. So that is one of the challenges here. There's another challenge, which is not mentioned here, is how about the hardware and the networking. Because now, I mean, the tooling is thought for software that runs in isolation mainly. Or with a limited set of elements. But what happens when we need to interact with either some specific pieces of hardware and do that automatically? You need a wide variety of hardware in place. That is a problem. And arranging in a given manner. That is a problem that you need to agree with the other part of the chain, right? And that's not trivial. And actually, think of an OpenStack-like environment. You could think of others. Actually, you are running in the own host, and you are actually what you are evaluating is also the installer or the process of doing a smooth installation, which is not ready for that, or is not 100% ready for DevOps. Let's see in the future, but now it's not ready. So even that software, I mean, you mentioned one case where you are focusing on one specific. We are taking options, right? But if you want to generalize it, and it's likely what you'll have in production. That is not trivial, right? So the closer that you get to the iron, the more complicated it is to implement that DevOps for real in terms that is conclusive and complete, right? So.
Thank you. Good points. So I'm going to bring that back to Adam. You know, in terms of a question to you as you hear this, and you know, you've been in the community and working for quite some time. Have you ever gone to any of your vendors and said, I want to use this open source software, and they've had a challenge with that? They've said, it's a concern, I want to do it. Right. That's my IP, now you're giving it away.
Of course, I'm going to go back to something we talked about, you talked about a little bit on here, which is, you know, how do you fail fast? And failing fast is really hard. You know, you can, for those of you who are vendors, you know how hard it is to sell something to an operator. You have no idea how hard it is to turn something off. I mean, if you think it's hard to sell, it's hard to get something taken out. So fail, i.e. stop using a set of tools, is really, really hard to get done. And so when I get asked, you know, how do we get this to all merge together? My first question is, you know, where are we at from our objectives and the management of our program? Because if you don't have a history of what you have done to get to failure, you can't justify failure, right? So if you're a manager and you're looking at failure, you're sitting there going, did the individual fail? Or did the project fail? Did the individual do all the work they needed to do to get the job done, but it failed anyway? Now, we have a habit inside my organisation of quickly getting to something doesn't work, it's okay. Let's do an assessment, figure on, move to the next thing. But if you don't have that history of why you got to that point, a manager inside a company is not going to turn around and say, hey, I want to chuck away $20 million worth of stuff. Right? It's a recipe for disaster. And so getting over that hurdle means getting a cadence in place and a performance management system in place and a set of objectives in place such that you can parse between did someone fail or did what we tried to do fail, and make sure that we look after our employees. And that's what causes so much of this slowness in failing and failing fast. That's why failing fast is hard. It's because you've got to be able to justify why you have failed.
And that's a disciplined process in terms of making sure you know what you're doing.
Little to do with engineering and NFV and stuff. It's process, right? And so much of DevOps is about changing process, and that's a key element associated with it. But you asked me a different question.
Now I can't remember. You were talking
Neither
so
can
well.
I can't remember.
Oh, it was about open source.
I can't remember.
Bringing in Marc.
So yeah, so
open source and using that with your vendors as well as in your environment. Have you pushed and they've been uncomfortable with it maybe? Or some of your thoughts.
So you know, I'm in a certain part of CenturyLink, and we have some very traditional areas where we operate, and we have some somewhat less traditional areas where we operate. And I happen to be in one of the less traditional areas. My guidance is I'm an open source first organisation, and so we go to open source first before we look for commercial products. And then as we go down that path, if we find something that we can't, if we can't find a suitable open source product, we'll then go looking for, a commercial product. And we usually we do ask for source code as well. We want source code because going towards the dev side of it, source code equals transparency. Going towards the ops side, network and customers equals transparency, right? So if you look in each direction, there are transparency problems in both directions. So, but in the procurement of componentry, source code equals transparency. And so as you can imagine, as you go down this path, this gets to be quite a difficult conversation. But vendors and our partners fit into this puzzle as well, as we use open source as well, because when we look at open source, we look at a variety of different things when we go and do it. And so we go and say, okay, here's a piece of open source. We're unlikely to download something from GitHub that was last contributed to by 3 guys in 2011. I mean, that's pretty unlikely we're ever going to use that, right? But what we do go looking for is we go looking for an ongoing submission of development, a diversity of people, and we also go looking for, are there vendor partners that are committing to this source code tree? So we know if we need to increase the horsepower, gain knowledge, we need to do it quickly, can we ask our vendor partners for help? And so when we look across the portfolio of componentry that we use, this is part of the key evaluation outside IPR that we go into to go and figure out which pieces of open source we use. But we have an open source strategy first. And I'm probably one of the biggest believers in open source in CenturyLink. I probably shouldn't say this in Silicon Valley, but in case you guys didn't realize, Elon Musk is not the father of the modern motor car. The modern motor car is the contribution of everybody who worked on a car since Ford bought out the Model T. That's how we got to where we are today. Science works very much in this way. Modern science is the combination of all scientists' work, since the particular area of discipline started. I believe that open source is that representation of our combined knowledge, and we're now crossing into a new era of open source where it is the embodiment of our shared ICT knowledge. And I'm a massive supporter of open source inside the company because I believe it will be one of the most powerful forces that our industry has going forward.
Well, thank you. 2 things I want to say to that. One is just to an Intel plug, because did you know Intel was one of the biggest suppliers of open source code?
But you also made a lot of money out of selling stuff, so you could do it, right?
That's a side point. But also I wanted to ask Marc before he needs to leave, as you hear that, are you doing handsprings? Did it make you happy to be able to hear that?
Well, I'm always happy when the idea of the shared investment and the collaborative innovation, which is, Adam, how I would have put it, what you're talking about, it actually starts to permeate the broader community. Because open source is a distribution model. Open source is not a deliverable within itself. And open source projects typically are creating frameworks and components that are getting adopted into broader solutions by the vendor community. Now, some operators who are forward-looking are starting to take on open source from a development perspective, but many other operators are working with their vendors and their partners to be able to adopt open source and be able to exploit the fact that you have a platform. And then what's relevant, I think, to this panel, and a methodology, because I think that this is one of the really key differentiators of the open source community. It implies a different methodology of how you can actually bring a lot of new functionality to bear. You actually leverage the community to create the non-differentiating part, and then vendors and operators themselves can actually be able to plug into that open source platform for the high value add or differentiating capabilities that they want to bring to market. So that's I think the open source, that's the power of open source. And I think the other aspect, though, that I wanted to cover before we have to unfortunately run because of another obligation is that I think that some of the things we've been talking about in the panel are startup pains. I think that's the premise of this panel, is that we're on a journey and we're near the beginning part of that journey. But I think when you look farther down the road as to what the implications of DevOps are going to be, and especially when you bring into bear the open source component to that, what we're going to find is that some of the requirements clarification are not necessarily as critical. I agree with what Anshu said in the beginning, which is it's about the fast fail model. Once you can get through the methodology, is going to be the way to validate not just the development integrity, but think about it from the business perspective. What we want to do is validate it based on, does it sell? Does it generate new revenue and profitability options that an operator may not have had before? Does it improve the competitive position? That's what we can do with an automated DevOps-driven development environment. The challenges we've been talking about, though, are to get beyond where we are today and then the individual and organizational implications of getting to this point, which are not going to be trivial, as we know from other parts of NFV and SDN, especially I suspected we talked about this with our operator panelists a little more, that they could share their own stories of how we actually were able to change the mindset to actually even get to this point.
Maybe, Javier, if you got to run, but you may have one more comment.
Yeah,
before.
I agree with what you said. The point is that somehow this is aspirational, and we need to we need as an industry to embrace the reality of the things. Software fails, and there's nothing wrong about it. You simply need to embrace that your software will fail, and probably need to fail with your customer, right? So it's good to have all the software being open source, but the reality is that there's some software that is not open source, and it's fine, and it's driving innovation as well. And we need to make both compatible and being able to bring them to an environment like this. The problem is that sometimes they feel threatened in an environment where we'll see that in spite of what they claim, their software is software, so we'll fail, right? No matter what you do, your software will eventually fail. And the sooner that you have that clarity, that transparency that we mentioned, the better. But that requires also a change of the mindset and understanding that the reality is always ugly. It's not like the model. It's something that is uneven. And you need to deal with that. If we manage, and it's part of the time that I would say 50% of the time that we spend in the lab is trying to figure out how the models apply to the ugly reality all the time and still can work and can help us to drive work. So I agree on the aspiration, but we don't be scared with the aspiration if we are not yet there, because we'll never be there. The world is more complicated always.
Yeah, great, thank you. And so our two gentlemen at the end need to leave to another one, but so thank you for coming. But I do have a question for Anshu, and maybe a hand for these two, and then Anshu, as you listen to this, and we chatted also around, you have open source, but then there's also standards in this telecom world that we live in, and standards are a must, from my opinion, in terms of how you make sure that there's interoperability and not too much work having to go into work every time to make that happen. What is your view of open source, as well as mixing that with standards and what's coming out in the industry?
Yeah, I wanted to briefly comment on what Javier said and about open source, and it kind of blends well with the question you asked, Keate. Open is a continuum. Okay, it is, open source is probably at the far right, but you can start with open interfaces and then standards and open source. I think the era of completely black box is kind of dying, where you just don't know what's going on inside, you just give it input and there's an output back. The open interfaces is like the most important minimum criteria to work with anybody, okay? And especially in the virtualization world, where there are VNFs coming from vendor A, vendor B, vendor C, how would the VNFs interact with each other, and even not with each other if the base platform? There has to be the open interface there, okay? And those open interfaces could be standards-based, or it is an API, open API-based or whatever. Standards are great because everybody can comply to the standards, but standards, as we all know, take a long time. So if a new company, startup, and we are in Silicon Valley, hundreds of startups, if they were to wait for the standards to evolve, they would have missed the boat, okay? So it's really, really important for a lot of us to start before even the standards are in place. But for things like 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, all of these are high investment projects. Okay, they rely on standards, a lot on standards, but there is some development done on each one of them even before the standards are finalized. So it's kind of a balancing act, I would say, where you wait for standards for some things and you develop the rest of it based on the open interfaces, open APIs, and I guess that's how the industry evolves. But it is certainly a continuum that we all follow, whether it's a vendor or a service provider.
Great, thank you, and thank you for, our time is short, and so we're up, but wanted to thank both of you for coming and sharing that. From what I have learned out of this is, one, it's hard. You know, DevOps and how you work with the vendors is very hard. Transparency is key to be able to do that, and eventually the world is going to settle down, and we'll move forward in terms of making the interoperability and our standards drive that much faster to get us to market. So thank you again for coming. Appreciate it.